Well, hello again everyone. We're continuing with our Ideologies course on NPTEL on the NPTEL program for 2019-20. We're going to look at work which shows the ways in which technocracy and managerialism both have an immense impact on our lives, and we're going to try and analyze those impacts in the light of the theory that we've already covered. We have two published papers to look at. One, if I'm not mistaken, both are from the Economic and Political Weekly. I'll send you the links, of course, they'll accompany this lecture with a PowerPoint slide. As I've said before, we can't show you the text, but we can certainly send you the links. The titles are not copyright, and you can, if you have the chance, you can look them up yourselves. But let's take a look at these two papers. One is by B. Subhasri, a doctor, and a very experienced doctor, who was written on her upbringing, the kind of training she had as a doctor, and the kind of practices she saw when she started working. Secondly, she also talks about her own attempts to change some of those. The second paper is by, as I mentioned before, by Rita and Abhijit Kothari, and it's on management training in India. Some of that may have changed since the paper was written, which was about I think 6 or 7 years ago. But we'll cover these two papers, Subhasri and the Kothari and Kothari paper, in succession. The first is on technocracy, and the second is on managerialism. Okay, well, the first paper is by Subhasri. We'll start on that now. And she writes about the way the medical profession views women's bodies. The paper was written perhaps 6 or 7 years ago, maybe a little bit more recently than that, and she draws on her own personal experiences as a medical student in a government medical college, then in her further training, and then her work with a Dalit women's organization, to reflect on the way the medical profession looks at, as she says, the woman and her body. What about her background? She had a very traditional Tamil Brahmin family background, as she says, joint family, traditional values, and she says it was the outside world that taught her and her female relatives, her cousins presumably, and her brothers and sisters, and her sisters that is, that there were restrictions, that women were discriminated against. She says in her household there was no such thing. And that includes television coverage as well, that taught them how women are discriminated against in society. Of course, starting her periods, the menarche, as she says, brought its own set of taboos at home. She was expected to confine herself to certain spaces, not to enter the kitchen or touch others. It was her grandparents who were much stricter about this. Her parents were less strict. And there were times when she rebelled. But she had instilled in her the idea that women's bodies were, I quote, dirty, especially during, again I quote, those times. Well, anyway, at school and at home, great value was placed, as she says, on science because of its supposed objectivity and neutrality, something that was looked up to. In her family, they were all expected to, in Subhasri's family, they were all expected to follow a career in science. They had scientists for parents, an engineer and a mathematics teacher, and so science was the obvious place to proceed. Well, she got a place at a government medical college in Chennai, and very early on in anatomy, groups of them had to dissect a cadaver. That's what doctors do, part of the training. And they had to compare the textbooks with the actual cadavers they were dissecting. But Subhasri also talks about about the nature of this encounter with the human body in the form of a dead body. She says the human body was, I quote, transformed into something as dead as a log. It was not seen as something that had once been a person with life and experiences and emotions. And she cites authorities who say health problems begin as much in the community as in the body? Well, we know that if we think even for a little bit about that. And she cites this to say this is one of the most important things health workers and their instructors have to learn. But what happened in the actual dissecting room? Well, they were given very sudden exposure to cadavers, and the impersonality of the encounter in the context did, as she says, help students cope. They sometimes gave the cadavers names, which may have been irreverent, but it may have been a coping mechanism, as she recognizes. And each body was studied separately. They studied a few in each semester, depending on the areas of the body, the upper limbs, the lower limbs, head and neck, chest and abdomen, and so on. But the sex of the cadaver didn't matter until they started studying the reproductive organs. And when they worked on a female cadaver, they were learning about the anatomy itself of the female external genital organs, and of course the internal reproductive organs. And the diagrams in the book seemed too complex, and nobody really wanted to talk about the issue openly, and it was always called the female anatomy, but something that they didn't identify with as their own, the women in the student group in the class. Of course, handling the cadavers, as you may well know, had its own social setting. The person who had to handle the cadavers was a Dalit. That is still the case. Recently, at the Chennai Photo Biennale, I saw an exhibition of photographs from a dissecting room, and there too the commentary made it clear it was only Dalits who would touch the cadavers. Only one of the faculty would touch the cadavers to help the students with the dissection, and it was up to the attendant to move the cadavers and turn them around and so on and so forth. This, as Subhasri says, reinforced an idea of the body as impure, perhaps by example rather than explicitly. What about the physiology lessons? The physiology of sex was, of course, part of the curriculum, quite right too. But the sexual act was described, and the processes of the male anatomy were described in great deal, but none of this was connected with pleasure or with men's or women's sexuality. And Subhasri gives an excerpt from the textbook that they were using, and this did two things. It impersonalized the physiology of the human body in respect of the sexual organs and the reproductive organs, as it did for the rest of the human body, and it equated female sexuality with childbearing. That particular textbook did, and she calls this patriarchal. Very likely, of course, right? So, I mean, the book, she actually quotes the passages from commentaries on this kind of book, and the attitudes involved were expressed most clearly in the way they were taught about the medical examination of a rape victim. This was part of the curriculum, but there was no discussion about how to handle such a situation sensitively. The practicalities of taking the samples to a court of law were never demonstrated, and the textbook simply spelt out what the law said. Subhasri quotes passages to show that those textbooks were very misogynist. For example, she quotes Flavia Agnes, who has written about this, and Flavia Agnes says, I quote, "A medical jurist has great responsibility, but very often they will find that the only reliable evidence depends on the liberty or life of a fellow being." That's a quotation from Cox, cited by Flavia Agnes. On the other hand, the concern for a victim of sexual assault is singularly lacking. It is little wonder, Flavia Agnes says, that young doctors make unwarranted comments about the conduct and character of a rape victim based on the level of elasticity of the vagina. The woman's chastity, morality and virginity is put in the doc. That's a quotation from Flavia Agnes. The classes on rape and sexual assault were taught separately for men and women students. It seems to have been felt by the faculty that details of sexual assault would be titillating, would inflame the men, would make both sexes uncomfortable, and would cause the men to, this is a quotation from the article, would result in the men's misbehaving, that's the actual quotation, with the women. So even the teaching modalities, the ways things were taught, as Supersri says, reinforced gender stereotypes and saw sexual assault from a, as she says, a voyeuristic perspective rather than a way that brought out the criminal nature of sexual assaults, which is exactly what they are, criminal offences. Now, they of course had to do forensic medicine studies, and this meant witnessing postmortems done for medico legal purposes. Again, the bodies were handled only by Dalit attendants, and the medical officer in charge would take detailed notes from at a distance from the table. The attendants seemed to be, or she says used to be, perennially under the influence of alcohol, presumably to cope with the stench and the stigma of their work. That is of course thoroughly understandable that they were drunk at work, even if it's unacceptable. Well, what about obstetrics and gynecology? And this department, this teaching department, was filled almost exclusively with women dealing with women. And Subhasri says she experienced magical moments of childbirth, day in and day out. But the rhetoric, the language, talked about the patients as patients. The outpatient area was arranged like an assembly line, presumably she's referring to factory assembly lines or production lines. All women who attended as patients had to go through a set of procedures and medical history and so on, and standard indicators, blood pressure and all the others were taken, and they were then, as Subhasri says, shunted off to the pelvic exam area. A senior gynecologist would see the patients one after another, and there was no time for the patients to dress or undress. All this was watched by groups of medical students, and the students also read out the medical history of the patient. There was no privacy, and anyone who mentioned this, well, was scolded and dismissed, sent off without the medical examination, without the pelvic examination. There was, I quote, no attempt to understand the context that she came from and her concerns, and to help her undergo something as traumatic as a pelvic exam. Similar things happened in the labour room, the delivery room, and much of this was done on a cold, hard metal labour cot with none of the family or friends around. There's no process of explanation or any such thing. The duty obstetrician was usually of assistant professor rank and would come in every 4 or 6 hours and do a sort of general round. A pelvic exam was done on each patient one after the other. So what were the conclusions? The human body was just a body. The human body was impersonal, not something each of us lived and experienced, lived with, lived in and experienced. It was also dirty. Social norms that assigned dirty jobs to Dalits were adhered to. So the social norms permeated the training establishment, the entire medical college. The difference between men and women, this is again, I quote from Subhasri, was only to do with the anatomy and functioning of the reproductive organs. That's the exact quotation. Emotions, pleasure, sexuality were essentialized into mere physiological processes. The woman's body was seen as titillating, and it could induce men to be aggressive. Men in power could use this hierarchy to abuse women. The woman's body was also something to be careful about. Women accessing healthcare, as Subhasri says, were a set of diseases, abnormalities and physiological processes. That no doubt could be said about men patients as well, but Subhasri quite rightly identified the particular ways in which this perspective affected women. And in addition, the physiological process of labour was seen to be pathological. Does that mean childbirth was seen as pathological? Women undergoing labour become patients? And these kinds of attitudes permeated the institution. They were repeated in the textbooks, they were repeated by teachers, they figured in the teaching methods and the ways teachers behaved and the system functioned. It also affected the ways the students were taught to socialize with their patients, referring to them as cases, as separate body parts, and as diseases rather than living humans, taking care not to get too involved emotionally with them. Well, Subhasri then went on to specialist training in gynecology in and she says, a premier academic and teaching institution in northern India. She says this was a revelation. For the first time, she saw women being treated as human beings. And this was an enormous difference for her, a real change. The whole process of labour was treated with respect. The women who were undergoing labour were treated with empathy. Senior teachers reinforced the importance of being respectful to patients by being role models. Simple things like covering the patient while examining her, providing adequate privacy. These were drilled in through daily practice. Now, this was obviously a very different world. And after that, after her postgraduate training, Subhasri moved to, as she says, a premier institution, a teaching institution in southern India, as a member of faculty in obstetrics and gynecology. She says this was also extremely rewarding. She saw birth companions being allowed inside the labour ward. By the way, this has been done for decades in other parts of the world. I can remember watching a delivery on television in the Netherlands. I mean, it was on British television. I had one particular program I happened to be watching. On British television, I watched a delivery in the Netherlands, and you didn't see the delivery itself. The woman was covered, and the husband was in the room throughout, helping and aiding and participating. And that must have been, when did I see it? 40 years ago? Well, perhaps things are changing in India too. And in the particular hospital Subhasri was working in, or this particular institution, the emphasis placed on evidence-based care and on promoting a positive experience by having someone else in, a member of the family perhaps, during the labour and delivery, was all noted in scientific evidence. Caesareans were audited once a month at a departmental meeting. Hysterectomies were also audited before the surgery, and so on. And this particular institution took great care to visit its peripheral hospitals, rural and other units to which they were attached in other parts of the state. And this gave students a sense of the infrastructure and resources in village settings, district settings, and help them to understand the realities of women's lives in these areas. The point is that senior faculty in this institution as well emphasized the importance and value of treating women patients as women, as people, presumably by implication men patients as well, by implication. Well, Subhasri here is talking about the way the medical profession sees women, or saw women during her training. She then goes on to talk about bodies as seen by the medical profession as against bodies as seen by women. She moved to a community health project in Maharashtra, and discovered an enormous gulf. She says an acute dissonance between how women viewed their bodies and how the medical profession viewed their bodies. The health worker training, which was part of a national program, the curriculum was stated nationally, contained a lot of medical information to be imparted to women. And one of the significant elements was women's reproductive health, of course. Now, this involved a session where women were given the privacy to explore themselves using a mirror. Now, Subhasri says that during this session on exploration, some women outright refuse to look at their own genital organs. Some others use the opportunity to explore their body. Some were surprised, others were relieved to discover that they indeed had a clitoris. Some felt a sense of shame looking at their private parts. We shouldn't be surprised at this multiplicity of reactions. The point is, what is the doctor to learn from this, or the medical student to learn from this? Well, one thing Subhasri noticed was that for a lot of the women there was a deep sense of shame about the body parts. And as we know, the names of women's private body parts the names are often used as obscenities and curse words. So she says that. And of course she continued with the training, and this also brought out, this gave the women presumably the confidence to start speaking about their experience of sexual abuse, in this case from the village school teacher. And of course that had never been spoken about in the school. Many of them had been at the same school, and of course they'd never spoken about it openly, but the training session encouraged them to do that. They also started to talk about the taboos they faced during menstruation and beliefs about how anything they touched during this period would, I quote, go bad. And some said how they'd rebelled, so in their families and in other contexts, and saw for herself that food she touched during her period didn't go bad, and so on. So this even occurred when she went to a temple. Apparently she had been led to believe that she would go blind if the god in the temple wanted her to, because she didn't have any children when she started her periods. She went into the temple, walked out again, nothing happened to her, and she later had a child. Well, the point here is the attitudes of the medical staff concerned, and the attitudes with which they were which they were taught during their training. Subhasri points out, as she moves towards her conclusion, that there was a good deal of physical abuse in a number of institutions of women during labour. This is an example drawn from Latin America, such as slapping women on the insides of the thighs during labour, pinching the labia or the perineum with surgical instruments, cutting the perineum, and suturing without adequate anesthesia. And this is all reported by women frequently in the studies that Subhasri cites. Now, let's start looking at the wider issues here. First of all, what were the technical justifications for the practices Subhasri has reported? Doctors have to learn about bodies. Why separate men and women students when we're training them about women's bodies and about men's bodies? What's the possible technical justification for that? What possible technical justification could be for the ways women were treated in the training institution that Subhasri attended, right, in the first one she attended? What possible technical justification could be for the high-handed, arrogant production line behavior in the production line type system in the maternity wards and maternity rooms? What justification, what technical or scientific justification could there be for the kind of treatment that's been reported from, for example, Latin America, or for advising hysterectomies when, as Subhasri herself says, there was no justifiable reason? The point here is that the technical expert, the doctor, and no doubt not just one doctor but sections of the profession, have, as Subhasri says, she says, the medical and allied professions, I quote, have imbibed mainstream notions of women's sexuality as something that needs control. In a hierarchical power relationship between the healthcare provider and the woman accessing care, such power is exerted through denigration of her sexuality. Subhasri goes on here. The reduction of women into bodies and further into reproductive organs paves the way for needless procedures like hysterectomies. Chop off, I quote from her, she quotes from another source, chop off something that is useless or has served its purpose. And also helps commercial interests within the medical profession. We saw this with the issue on technocracy and the licensing of drugs, the British paper published by Abraham and Shepherd following a field survey. Well, Subhasri then says that she then goes on to talk about the ways the medical profession views human bodies and specifically women's bodies, and she wants to highlight 3 of these views. The body is essentialized and reduced to anatomy and physiological processes, the more so in the case of women, where their bodies are seen as equal to those of men, with the only difference being in the reproductive organs. This reductionist view contributes to the impersonality of professionals and the way they treat patients seeking care, the vocabulary of cases, names of organs, and so on to refer to individual patients reinforces this impersonality. In an extreme form, it can lead to insensitivity and violence towards women in labour and women patients. It can also give sanction to unethical practices like unnecessary caesareans and hysterectomies. Now, Subhasri notes that this reductionist view of the human body is the dominant paradigm. But, as she's shown, it is modified by existing patriarchal norms where that is necessary, or those norms are necessary and convenient. The view of the body as dirty means that any job dealing with cadavers gets assigned to Dalits, women's bodies are seen as titillating or inflammatory, and women's sexuality is viewed solely from the point of childbirth. Subhasri is very strong here, very firm. The medical profession, I quote, the medical profession also contributes to perpetuating patriarchal values in society by its practiced behavior and its treatment of women and patients. Well, Subhasri says her own experience of teaching women in rural areas in Maharashtra and Tamil Nadu revealed to her that women could see that the knowledge of the body could be empowering and liberating. But, she says, the way the same kind of knowledge was imparted in medical college was extremely oppressive and disempowering. Their education, their medical education, was totally bereft, that's her own term, of the politics of health, true of health generally, but more so with women's health, where gender as a determinant of health went totally unacknowledged. Subhasri says a great dissonance exists between the way medical training, professional training in medicine, and the established behavior of the qualified professionals. This greatly needs to be, well, an enormous gulf exists between the profession through its training and its behavior, the way it views women and their bodies, and the way women themselves view their bodies. As she says, special investments need to be made in education and training of medical students to change this view. She concludes quite politely, this view affects women's lives in adverse ways. That's putting it very politely indeed. There could be much, much stronger descriptions of the nature and training and of doctors, as Subhasri says, particularly in relation to women. Yes, this would be true of the way men are treated as well. The significance of training and medical attitudes for women is what Subhasri has brought out here, and she's very forceful about it. The thoughtful, reflective conclusion that medical education and training need to be changed is put very politely. She could have put it very much more strongly and left to myself. I'm sure if I had the chance I would certainly do so. But she's made the point in a very forceful, Subhasri has made the point in a very forceful and clear paper, drawing on her own experience in different kinds of institutions and her attempts to change attitudes and practice in her own work. So that concludes our examination of technocracy. The point for us, the real point for us, is to identify not only the conduct and training and the practices concerned, but to identify the ways in which moral, political, social attitudes permeated the training, well, we shouldn't be surprised about that. The question then is, in what ways can particular practices and attitudes and comments and particular ways patients are treated, in what ways could many of them possibly be justified by the claim to technical knowledge? I'm a doctor, so I'm going to treat you like this. Well, what is it about being a doctor that justifies a doctor in treating patients in the ways that Subhasri has described? Now that is really significant, right? I may have mentioned the Black Report earlier, published in the Black Committee reported, or Professor Sir Douglas Black reported in 1980, if I'm not mistaken. In 1979, a Conservative government the Conservative Party had won a majority in the British Parliament. Senior figures in the Conservative Party, and no doubt other wider sections of membership, seemed to have been convinced that poorer patients were using the British National Health Service to an excessive degree. Professor Sir Douglas Black, FRS, was appointed to investigate. His conclusions were so embarrassing to the government that the report was embargoed for publication, I think for about 14 months, and may have been timed for release after the United Kingdom had won the Falklands War, when the government confidently and rightly expected to be re-elected with a big majority, which it was. The Black Report is freely available on the net. Professor Sir Douglas Black found that patients who were clearly educated and from the upper classes got ultimately more and better treatment from National Health Service staff, treatment to which every patient was entitled, than patients from poorer classes. And they got explanations, they got more polite treatment, they got ultimately better medical care. This was an enormous shock to the medical profession and all involved in NHS care and training, nursing staff, radiographers, you name it. And very quickly changes were introduced, and I saw this myself when I went to see my GP the next time. I didn't sit across a desk from the GP, we sat at 45 degrees each to the desk with, it was the early days of computer screens, with a computer screen in front of us. Since then, other legislation has made our medical records much more accessible and so on. But it was clear that very quickly that the Black Report had made a difference, a significant difference to training. The discovery of this class hierarchy in the treatment of patients was, of course, first of all, it showed that this was unconsciously done. The staff themselves didn't know it, but it was a great shock and it brought about significant changes. So this has happened in other parts of the world, right? This has happened elsewhere. It may well have happened since Subhasri published her article, and no doubt the students people like Subhasri train will, I'm sure, work very differently than the people who taught Subhasri and with whom she started working with in her younger days. Right, the point for us to note is the Technic Rat no doubt has their expertise. We wouldn't doubt that when we went to see a doctor. But we need to be able to see in what ways their conduct towards us can be justified by their technical expertise. In other words, at what point are they importing their own moral, social and other presuppositions, and could they justify those presuppositions on technical grounds? That is the point about technocracy. One implication, I've written about this elsewhere, is that unless we take some kind of interest both in the moral and political and social presuppositions and in the technicalities, we're going to be at the mercy of the technocrats and their imported attitudes, the social, moral and political attitudes that permeate their own thinking. We shouldn't be surprised by those. The point is, how are we going to engage with them? And that is the question that a study of technocracy should lead us to conclude with. Right, we can now go on to our second topic here, that is managerialism, our second worked example. This is a paper by Well, alphabetically, Abhijit and Rita Kothari, published again in the Economic and Political Weekly. This was in 2011, on management training in India. And the authors, Kothari and Kothari, start with an example of the Diamond House, a colonial building in a quiet lane in Bombay. It was then Mumbai. And the role this house has played foundationally in shaping the diamond trade in India. But this was a story of a traditional trade. The owner, Surajmal Lalubhai, took young men in from Palanpur, and at his suggestion they would come and live with the family and be trained in the diamond and jewellery trade. Surajmal Lalubhai was one of the pioneers of diamond trade in India. And Palanpuri Jain became a very, very substantial figure in the diamond trade. And he would train people, and people would say, well, you're creating your own competitors, you're training your own competitors. And he would say, well, in effect, that doesn't matter. He travelled in Europe in the early 1900s, set up an agency in Paris, and showed, as the authors say, a combination of foresight, strategic thinking, and organizational skills, which played a major role in the immense advantage and later domination of the diamond trade by Palanpuri Jains, people of Surajmal Lalubhai's own caste. Now, this may have been, the Indian belief in faith. He said when asked about competitors, well, fate will decide that. Well, that could also be, as the authors say, the confidence and optimism shown by any entrepreneur who has an understanding of their own strategic advantage in their business. Having fellow community members in the business made certain things very much easier. It's, as the authors say, a fascinating story of local global businesses, and it may well be one of the most fascinating in the world. But they use the example to continue and show us that this kind of story, at the time they were writing, certainly 2011, doesn't figure in standard management theory, whether as apart from being an occasional case study or an addendum. Now, this kind of theory would be deemed to have little value. It would exist by itself as a narrative, providing insights on the roles of trust and strategy and so on. It might get dismissed as history, that was then, that was the mid-19th century and so on, or the late 19th century. But something that lacks generalizability and, as they themselves say, macro truths. Well, Kothari and Kothari challenge that. What they identify is, as they say, absences stroke epistemological blocks. Epistemology, of course, the theory of knowledge in management studies. And they go on to argue that institutes of management in India need to produce grounded and contextualized research and pedagogy, so that students and scholars can arrive at, I quote, a more nuanced, variegated and non-elitist understanding of business practices in the Indian context. And they say that there we are in 2011, that was particularly important at the time, may still be, given, as they say, the speed and hard-nosed motivation with which management schools are proliferating, end of quotation. But what does contextualized research mean here? They don't mean a dichotomy between theory and context or theory and practice. They're not pleading for more context-based research by itself. What they're pointing out is that local examples and case studies does happen, but what they argue for is a revision. What Kothari and Kothari argue for is a revision of the existing boundaries of knowledge, because the existing bodies of knowledge are drawn almost exclusively from the West. In the major management schools, they certainly seem to have been at the time, and provide no kind of interface with what they call the fecund and indigenous local circumstances and business practices. The point about the Surajmal Lalubhai example, they say, was that it was not just another example of strategy and acumen, which we might talk about in abstract terms. It draws attention to the role played by kinship networks, by religion, Jainism in this instance, the social structure of the community, and by economic and social capital in inseparable ways. The point is that the kinship networks, the religion, the social structure of the community, all create economic and social capital. That may not be new, but what Kothari and Kothari want to bring out, and what they argue for, is that these are non-replicable strategic resources in this particular business group, in this case the Palampuri Jains. So what they suggest is that management research in India should draw upon, they suggest is what they say, what we suggest therefore is that management research in India draw on the tradition of business practices which are informed by Indian sociology and history, to verify, as they say, existing paradigms of management, and if necessary reformulate them in the Indian context. The outcome may or may not lead to, as they say, to an Indian, in quotation marks, management framework, but as they say, this practice, this interrogation, this investigation of Indian management practices in their social, moral, religious location, as they say, will certainly help generate an interrogation, a questioning of management theories which, they say, are taught as unquestionable truths in India. They add, in any case, the term Indian management theory could well be internally contradictory. The point is that they want to emphasize, and they're right, central to what they do is the interface between management studies and contextual knowledge, and this contextual knowledge, as I say, can be is created under the rubric of disciplines such as sociology and history. And those, in fact, were the background to management studies when it originated in the late 19th century in its modern form. Well, Kothari and Kothari go on to talk about the origins of management theory in the United States. I've covered some of that in the lectures. I mentioned this particular paper briefly. But the authors here are right to say, they say quite rightly, they're not concerned with the intrinsic nature of management studies and the premises on which that is based, but their questions are about how management studies are disseminated, how the discipline is disseminated in India, and about what they say is the near total absence of contextualization and what they call a lack of anchoring in traditional disciplines. They cite sources here, other people have written about similar things, but as they say, the received wisdom of management as it had developed in the United States and some other developed countries in the West was adopted almost in its entirety, and their example here is India. They say this is evident in the uniformity of curricula across management schools in India, and the absence, well, there's a noticeable absence of research that tests, interrogates some of the fundamental tenets of management in the Indian context. As to whether they're relevant or not, whether they can inform what we do or not, there simply isn't much work doing that, or wasn't at the time this paper was written, 2011. So what they say is that what Indian management theory needs is to reconnect with other disciplines, Indian history, sociology and anthropology, with a focus on business history, business communities and entrepreneurial initiatives, whether by individuals or by social groups. And this, as they say, could redefine theories of strategy and organization and marketing. India's economic history, of course, has been written about in immense detail, and the literature is absolutely colossal. But the authors here say engagement with that could provide an interesting, if not conflicting, interface with management studies. The point about that is that this could offer fertile and creative possibilities for work in management studies. So the issue here, as they say, lies in the lost opportunity to bring a management perspective to the existing research, or draw on the existing research, Indian economic history and Indian history, towards the further development of Indian management studies. Well, this has happened in other countries as well. It's happened in Japan, as the authors point out, and they say that this particular work needs to be done in Asia, particularly China and India. We've already met Japan. Bob Locke has commented that there was comparatively little interest in United States management theory, in the different ways Japanese management worked in the light of Japanese theory or Japanese corporate culture, or Japanese culture and corporate culture. Now, the point here is that the research should not be structured by a priori thinking. It should be guided, as the authors say, by the phenomenon being studied. And that means the research should be located in unique and local contexts, and the aim should not be generalizability. The aim should be, as they say, to generate valid constructs and models. Rather than going in with the aim of generalizability, we should try and generate valid constructs and models. Of course, this would need the questioning of existing models and constructs and a strong grounding in the context. That would mean regional, linguistic, cultural, possibly caste level or faith-based knowledge of particular business cultures and so on, precisely so as to strengthen the applicability of any findings or models, or any models that were then devised. Locally relevant knowledge, here Kothari and Kothari quote from another published work, locally relevant knowledge requires the recognition of the boundaries of existing management knowledge and a careful contextualization of new research projects. Now, the implication is that researchers in Asia may develop indigenous discourses on organization phenomena and couple these loosely with global debates on related phenomena and so on. But this would also require more self-confidence in indigenous research agendas. That's a quotation from a published work which Kothari and Kothari have given an excerpt from. So, what Kothari and Kothari want is that management studies and management research in India should make ongoing and robust linkages with knowledge produced in other disciplines, right? In other words, get reading other things as well and align the relevance of management theory to India, and document other interventions of a similar kind. And Kothari give sources here. So this could lead in some quite interesting directions. Meta reviews have been done. Some, and Kothari cite these, and some alternative theoretical frameworks have been provided by scholars who've even drawn on Indian scriptures to draw new models of understanding the self rooted in India's cultural tradition. Of course, cultural traditions in India are as complex as they are anywhere else, but Kothari and Kothari's point here is that this kind of work seems to circulate only within relatively small academic circles. So why is there not more empirical field research on context of business activities and practices in India? And Kothari suggests that there is what I would call a kind of colonial hangover here. They don't say that, but they suggest that a possible answer is that India's first exposure to what we see as managerialism or management today was through colonial structures, and post-colonial theories of management, they do note that management could be said to have started. The introduction to modern Western management in India could have taken place with what they call the first multinational corporation, the British East India Company. Now, it was a result of British rule as well that technologies of the Industrial Revolution were made available to India, and the administrative and modern banking and managing agency system were introduced, in a sense, both by the East India Company and by the post-colonial power, by the colonial power. Now, what about the post-colonial Indian state? This largely continued with inherited colonial systems, as we know very well. We don't have to look very far to see that. Now, of course, post-colonial and postmodern and other discourses in the academic world, in humanities and social sciences, have successfully, often very sharply, interrogated and even undermined the edifices upon which Western knowledge is held to be superior. But this seems not to have happened, according to Kothari and Kothari. This seems not to have happened in management studies. And that's their argument, that management studies in India could really benefit from field examination of local business practices. They do say management education in India started with the establishment of the IIMs, the Indian Institutes of Management, and they were set up in collaboration with American universities. Unsurprisingly, naturally, the early scholars who joined them were trained in the United States in research and, as the authors note, admirably high standards. But these were based on Western management paradigms, or perhaps we would go further and say United States management paradigms. New ideas have been welcomed, but the majority of new recruits to these institutions have carried out their doctoral and postdoctoral work in the United States as well. This isn't unique to India, but it does mean that in Asia as a whole, according to the authors, there is a, how should I put it, a dearth of specific research among Asian management scholars on local contexts and local business practices and so on. But what this also shows is that the ways in which management theory has been introduced into India has reinforced the dominance, the hegemony of the Anglo-American academy. Well, those are historical legacies, and those can be altered. It's very likely they already are being altered. But there are issues faced with research on access to larger firms and organizations, and legal disclosure requirements would obtain. Undoubtedly, firms may not be reluctant to be the subjects of management research, and this has been done. The Indian banking system, the Indian stock market, and so on have all been selected for research by a number of scholars in management. So yes, Indian contexts do get examined, but these are largely in the corporate and formal business sector, or what we might call the official business sector. And according to Kothari and Kothari, management scholars have not paid enough attention to the small merchant, the small self-employed entrepreneur, if that's given in quotation marks, as well as firms and businesses in the unorganized sector, which may be a better term than informal or quasi-formal sector. Now, these are repositories of traditional business practices and historical legacies. And they're examples. They characterize a domain of business activity that shows the interconnection of sociocultural and economic factors in all their complexity. Now, apparently, even if the contribution of society, historical inheritances, linguistic and regional factors, perhaps faith membership and so on, has been acknowledged, even if those factors have been acknowledged, we would really need access to insiders in the business in order to gain the data we might need as management scholars. That is, sensitive data such as sales figures and profits. That might be tough enough to obtain anyway, but unless we really knew the context, the task would be even harder. Gaining access, of course, would depend on social and familial issues, the motivations that drive traditional Indian business people, and we may need to be an insider in the first place. How are we to overcome that if we're management researchers? Kothari and Kothari suggest that, like anthropologists, we spend long periods of time, usually several years, with the subjects of our research, gaining their trust and thereby gaining access. Well, those are the kinds of suggestions that Kothari and Kothari make. It is quite likely, I've said earlier and I say it again, that management schools in India are well aware of this. It would be a little surprising if they weren't, but this paper shows us something of the kind of point I made about managerialism in general. The claim to generalizability and predictive power is ultimately, I have argued, drawing from the philosophy of social sciences, incoherent. In other words, is management studies or managerialism any different from any other way of thinking about organizing human activity, and can it lay claim to any kind of specialist knowledge? In other words, is there any such thing as management or managerialism? And that is the issue that Kothari and Kothari brought out for us. I'll conclude this topic by saying that we're globally familiar with the language of managerialism. We're globally familiar with it in all its manifestations, but we have often learnt the hard way that it is ultimately completely incoherent, and as I have said in print more than once, it is ultimately totalitarian, and it has not an iota of genuine knowledge on which to base its claims as generalizable and predictive. So that concludes our topic of technocracy and managerialism. I'll send you the links for these two papers. I'm not sure about accessibility to them, but it's one reason I've spent some time talking about them, but I'll send you the titles and links. We shall go on in our next topic with our next topic. We shall talk about nationalism, and we'll make a start on that in the next lecture.